The card room at Wexbury House had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something is about to be taken from someone, and Eleanor Hartley stood at the center of that quiet with her chin level and her gloved hands folded against the front of her plain gray gown. She had not asked to be the subject of the evening's entertainment. She had come to settle a small account, a matter of £300 owed to her late father's estate by a man who had not expected the daughter to come collecting, and now that man stood across the inlaid table from her with a glass of claret in his hand and contempt arranged carefully on his face. The room had filled behind her without her noticing. The first ball of the autumn season had emptied its overflow into this smaller chamber, and the overflow had found, in her, a thing to watch. "You will forgive me," said Lord Crandall loud enough to carry, "if I do not take the word of a woman who appears at a respectable house with a forged paper and a story about debts. There is no debt. There was never any debt. The lady is, I am sorry to say it plainly, a liar." The word landed and spread. Somewhere near the door, a fan stopped moving. Eleanor felt the heat climb her throat and refused it. Passage to her face, and she did not look away from the man who had just unmade her reputation in front of 40 people she would now have to live among or flee. What none of them could see, what she had carried into the room folded flat against her ribs beneath the gray wool, was that she had come prepared. She did not yet reach for it. There is a particular cruelty in being called a liar by a man who knows precisely what he owes. And she let herself feel the whole shape of it before she answered, because she had learned that a steady voice costs more when the body beneath it is shaking. "Stay with me through this one, because the woman they have decided to disbelieve is holding the one thing that will turn this room inside out, and she is not finished." At the far edge of the chamber, near the cold hearth where the candlelight did not quite reach, a man stood who had not moved since Crandall began to speak. He was tall and very still, dark-coated, and his eyes had fixed on Eleanor with an attention that had nothing of pity in it, and nothing of the crowd's appetite either. He was the Duke of Ashworth, and no one in the room could have told you why a duke who spoke to almost no one had come to stand so close to a quarrel that was beneath him. Eleanor did not know him. She felt the weight of his looking the way one feels a draft from an open door, an awareness at the back of the neck, and she did not turn toward it because she could not yet afford to be distracted from the man who meant to ruin her. To understand how Eleanor Hartley came to be standing in another man's card room, collecting a debt, the world insisted did not exist. You must go back 6 months, to the morning after her father was buried. Thomas Hartley had been a country attorney of modest practice and immodest honesty, the sort of man who kept every receipt and trusted that the keeping of them would one day matter. He died in March of a fever that took him in 9 days, and he left his only daughter a small house with a large mortgage, a reputation for fairness that paid no bills, and a locked deed box whose contents she had not had the heart to examine until the creditors began their letters. She was 24 years old, unmarried, with a mother 3 years dead, and no brother to stand between her and the men who came to the door with figures in their mouths. What the men did not know, and what Eleanor discovered across 3 nights at her father's desk, with a single candle and a magnifying glass, was that Thomas Hartley had been owed a great deal more than he had ever owed anyone. The deed box held the proof of it. Promissory notes signed and witnessed, receipts of loans extended to gentlemen who had borrowed against their land and their honor and repaid neither. Letters, in the borrower's own hands, acknowledging the sums. Her father had never pressed for repayment because pressing was not in his nature, and the gentleman had counted on exactly that. And now the gentleman was dead, and his daughter was hungry, and the notes were still good. The largest of them, £300, bore the name of Lord Crandall. She had written to him first, as a lady should, a careful letter requesting at his convenience the settlement of an old account. He did not answer. She wrote again. He did not answer. When she learned that he would be at the Wexbury ball, she understood, with the clarity that hunger brings, that a man who would not answer a letter might answer a question asked in front of his peers. And so she had pinned the note inside her bodice and put on her one good gown and gone to ask it. She had not understood that he would simply deny the whole of it. She had not understood that a man with rank could make the truth itself sound like impudence. To the season, she was nobody. A provincial attorney's daughter in gray wool among the silk, a woman with no title and no protector and no invitation she could properly claim, and the room had decided what she was before she opened her mouth. The decision was comfortable for everyone in it. It is always more comfortable to believe the woman with nothing is lying than to believe the Lord with everything is a thief. Eleanor lifted her chin 1 degree further and said, in a voice that did not rise, "I have written to you twice, my lord. You did not reply to either letter. I think you remember the letters." "I remember no letters," Lord Crandall said, and he smiled at the room as he said it, inviting them to share the joke of her. "I remember nothing of you at all, which is rather the difficulty." The Duke of Ashworth, at the cold hearth, set down a glass he had not been drinking from. The small sound of it touching the marble was the only sound he made, and afterward he was watching Crandall the way a man watches a horse he has decided he does not trust. Here is what no one in that room knew about the man at the hearth, and what Eleanor would not learn for some weeks yet. 3 years before, the Duke of Ashworth had trusted a friend with the management of a sum meant for the widow and child of a tenant who had died in his service, a steady man named Bellamy, whose family had farmed Ashworth land for 4 generations, and the friend had taken the money and produced papers to prove it had never existed. And the widow had been turned out into the lane in October, because Ashworth, young and proud and certain of his own people, had not looked closely enough at the documents until it was too late to matter. He remembered the day she came to the great house. He remembered that he had been shooting and had not wished to be disturbed, and that he had glanced at the papers his friend put before him and seen the friend's confident face and signed away the woman's last claim on his protection in the time it took to drink a cup of tea. The child had not survived the winter that followed. He had learned of it in the spring when learning of it could mend nothing, and he had ridden out to find the grave himself and stood at it in the rain with no one to see him, which was the only weeping he had permitted himself in 3 years. He kept the widow's last letter folded in a silver case in his breast pocket, and he had not in all that time been able to bring himself to hear a man's smiling denial of a debt without feeling the weight of that case against his heart. He did not know Eleanor Hartley. He knew the shape of what was being done to her. He had seen it done before, and he had been, that time, the one too slow to stop it, and he had promised himself that if the chance ever came again, he would not be slow. And now the chance was standing in gray wool at the center of a card room being called a liar by a man who knew better. Eleanor did not reach for the note. Not yet. Med. She had calculated in the long, quiet hours of preparing for this that the document would only matter if the room first understood she was not afraid. And a woman who produces her proof too quickly looks like a woman who fears not being believed. So, she stood. She let Lord Crandall enjoy his audience. She watched him grow expansive with the pleasure of winning, watched him turn to a knot of gentlemen and murmur something that made them laugh, and she filed the laughter away with everything else she would not forgive. "It is a sad thing," said a woman's voice from near the window, cool and carrying and entirely unhurried, "when a girl of no family imagines that boldness will pass for breeding. One does feel for her, but one cannot have every attorney's daughter arriving with a grievance and a tale." This was Lady Crandall, the Lord's mother, the dowager who had ruled 3 drawing rooms since before Eleanor was born. She sat very upright in dove-gray silk with diamonds at her throat, and she had spoken not to Eleanor but to the room, the way one addresses a footman about a stain on the carpet. Her certainty was a kind of architecture. She had decided what Eleanor was, and her deciding carried more weight in that chamber than any paper could, because the dowager had spent 40 years teaching this society whose word to take. Eleanor met the older woman's gaze and held it. "My family was honest, madam. I find that is not so common a thing as breeding and rather harder to counterfeit." A murmur went through the crowd, uncertain whether to be scandalized or impressed, and at the cold hearth the Duke of Ashworth's mouth moved very slightly, a thing that on another man might have become a smile, and on him merely registered as interest. The dowager's fan paused at exactly the height that signaled displeasure. To those trained to read it, the lever had been pulled. The room was hers, or so she believed, and her belief had never yet been wrong in a room. What the dowager did not know was that her son had made one careless mistake. The promissory note Eleanor carried had been witnessed, at the time of its signing by Lord Crandall's own steward, a man named Marsh, who had served the family 30 years and been turned off without a character the previous spring, when the family's economies grew tight. Marsh had signed the note. Marsh remembered the note. And Marsh, as it happened, now kept the books for the Duke of Ashworth, which was the entire and unremarkable reason that a duke who spoke to almost no one had come to stand at a cold hearth and watch a woman he did not know be called a liar by a man his own steward had warned him against. The evening at Wexbury House did not end in Eleanor's vindication. That is not how these things move. It ended in her quiet withdrawal, her back straight, and her face composed, through a crowd that parted for her the way crowds part for the contagious. And she walked the 1.5 miles to her cold lodging because she could not afford a chair, and she did not weep until she had bolted her own door behind her. She had failed. She had taken her one good chance, and a lord had simply denied her into nothing. And now the story would travel. The attorney's daughter who came to a ball with a forged paper, and no door in the county would open to her again. She did not know that she had been seen, not by the room, by the one man at the hearth who had watched her refuse to break, and had recognized in her refusal a particular courage she had spent 3 years failing to find in himself. The Duke of Ashworth called on her. 4 days later. She had no servant to announce him, so she opened her own door to find him filling it, hat in hand, his height making her small front room smaller, and her first feeling was not flattery, but a cold spike of fear, because a duke at the door of a ruined woman meant nothing good in the language she had been taught. He saw the fear. He did not pretend it away. "You came to settle a true debt," he said without preamble, his voice low and level. "I came to tell you that I believe it is true, and to ask to see the paper, if you will permit it. I have a reason to wish such papers honored. The reason is mine, and need not concern you." Eleanor stood with her hand on the door, and did not open it further. "Half the county believes me a liar on the word of a lord. Why should the word of a duke run the other way?" "Because I employ the man who witnessed your father's note," Ashworth said. "His name is Marsh. He signed it. He remembers signing it. And he is, in my experience, the only honest man Lord Crandall ever kept in his house. Which is why Crandall no longer keeps him. She let him in. She did not entirely trust him, and she made him sit in the one good chair while she stood, and she watched his face, while he read the note and the letters and the receipts in her father's careful hand. He read slowly. He read the way a man reads who has been ruined once by reading too fast. When he set the papers down, he did not say anything for a long moment, and when he spoke, it was not about the money. "Your father kept good records," he said. "Better than most men of great estate. He must have known they would have to speak for him one day, when he could not." It was not what she had expected, and it found the soft place beneath her composure, and her eyes stung before she could prevent it. She turned away to the cold grate so he would not see, and she heard him stand, and she braced for him to come closer, and he did not. He stayed where he was. "Sit down," he said. "You have not eaten today, I can see it. Sit down, and I will arrange for the rest, and you will not refuse me, because pride is a luxury, and you cannot at present afford the price of it." It was a command. It was entirely a command, level and certain, and she heard underneath it the thing he would not say outright, which was that he had decided to stand between her and the men with figures in their mouths, and she sat down because her legs had stopped wishing to hold her, and because no one had told her to sit and be cared for since her father died. She did not know yet that this was who he was, that his coldness was a wall built over a grave. She knew only that her body had betrayed her, that she had wept in front of a duke, and that the duke had looked away to let her do it. If this story has found you tonight, I hope you will stay until Eleanor stands in that room again, because she will. And the second time, she will not be alone. Now let me tell you what the Duke did next. He did not pay the debt for her. She would not have permitted it, and he understood that, which was itself a kind of seeing. Instead, he did a harder thing. He took her father's papers to a solicitor, a careful elderly man named Pellingham, and he had the promissory note examined, the signatures verified. The steward Marsh brought in to swear before a magistrate that he had witnessed Lord Crandall set his own hand to the page. He built, out of Thomas Hartley's careful keeping, a case that no drawing-room could deny, and he did it, quietly. Over 3 weeks, while the county laughed at the attorney's daughter and Lord Crandall enjoyed the warmth of having won. Eleanor saw the Duke of Ashworth a great deal during those 3 weeks, on the proper pretext of the legal matter, and the propriety wore thinner, with every meeting in a way neither of them named. He came to her lodging with Pellingham, and then increasingly without him. He brought her father's papers back, annotated in his own hand. He brought once a basket of things from his own kitchen that he set on her table without comment, as though provisioning a garrison, and when she opened her mouth to refuse, he said only eat, and she ate. He asked her about her father. He listened to the answers as though they were depositions in a matter that mattered to him personally, and she found herself telling him things she had told no one. The 9 days of the fever, the locked deed box, the 3 nights with the candle. One afternoon he was reading by her window in the failing light, her father's letters in his hands, and she looked up from her own work and found that she had been watching him for some while without intending to. Watching the way the gray light caught the hard line of his jaw, the way his thumb moved along the edge of a page he had stopped reading. She became aware, all at once and against her will, of exactly where he was in the small room. She knew it without looking, the way one knows where the fire is. Her heart had begun to beat in her throat for no reason her mind would supply, and when he raised his eyes and found hers already on him, neither of them looked away as quickly as propriety required, and the room grew very warm for a place with no fire lit. "Forgive me," she said, and did not specify for what. "There is nothing to forgive," he said, and his voice was not quite level the first time she had heard it slip, and that small failure of his composure undid her more than any speech could have. What she did not know, what he had not told her, was that he had begun to dread the conclusion of the legal matter, because the legal matter was the only honest reason he had to cross her threshold, and when it ended, he would have to find another reason or stay away, and he had discovered in himself a violent unwillingness to stay away. He, who had built 3 years of careful distance over the grave of a woman he had failed, had walked straight into the one situation he had sworn never to enter again, the position of a man whose action or inaction would decide whether a woman was saved or ruined. He told himself it was justice. He knew by the second week that it was not only justice. The Dowager learned of it because the Dowager learned of everything. Lady Crandall did not summon Eleanor. She did something colder. She called upon the Duke of Ashworth himself, in his own house, and she sat in his drawing-room with her diamonds and her certainty, and she explained to him with every appearance of doing him a kindness exactly what he was risking. "You are a young man still," she said, "and grief makes young men foolish in particular ways. I knew your mother. I would not see you throw yourself away on an adventuress with a satchel of papers and a clever tongue. She is a provincial attorney's daughter, Your Grace. She is nothing. Whatever she has made you feel, it will not survive the saying of it aloud. In company, and you know that as well as I do." The Duke of Ashworth let her finish. He was, those who knew him agreed, a man of formidable patience, and he spent all of it listening to the Dowager call Eleanor. Nothing in his own drawing-room. When she was done, he stood, which obliged her to understand the interview was over, and he said, "You witnessed your son deny a debt he owes. I have the note, the steward, and the magistrate's record. I am going to ask you to consider, madam, how you would prefer that to become known." It was not a threat in the shape of a threat. It was worse for her because it was simply true. The Dowager left his house with her certainty, for the first time disturbed, and she went home and did the thing that frightened people do, which was to escalate. She arranged the dark moment, and she arranged it with care. There was to be a dinner at Wexbury House. The same house, the same chandeliered rooms where Eleanor had been called a liar, and the Dowager saw to it that the Duke of Ashworth was invited, and that a particular young lady was seated at his right hand. Her name was Miss Sophia Vane, a diamond of the season 18, and lovely and entirely without malice, raised from the cradle to be exactly the correct choice for exactly such a man. And she had been told that the Duke admired her, and she had no reason to doubt it. The Dowager intended that Ashworth should be seen, publicly and unmistakably attached to the right sort of woman, so that whatever foolishness he imagined himself to feel for the attorney's daughter would die for want of air. And she intended that Eleanor should hear of it. Eleanor heard of it the worst way. Marsh, the steward, who had grown fond of her in the manner of an old servant with no family of his own, came to her lodging grey-faced to tell her that the engagement was as good as announced, that the whole county expected it, that the Duke had been seated beside Miss Vane and had not refused the seating. He told her because he thought she should not learn it from a stranger's mouth in a shop. He did not understand that there was no kind way to deliver it. "He has been kind to me," Eleanor said when Marsh had gone, alone in her cold room with her father's papers stacked on the table. "Kindness is not the same as choosing. I always knew that. I told myself I knew that." She had known it. She had told herself every day of those 3 weeks that a duke's attention to a ruined woman could mean nothing in the end, that the legal matter would conclude and he would return to his own world and she would be left with £300, if she was fortunate. And a story about the season she had nearly been ruined and then quietly was not. She had told herself all of it. The telling had not prepared her at all for the way it felt to be told. She had been right. Her body knew the truth before her pride would permit it. She sat down at her father's desk because she could not trust her legs, and she pressed her father's oldest letter flat beneath her hand the way she had pressed it the night she found it. And she let herself, for 1 hour, grieve a thing she had refused to admit she wanted. Then she did what her father's daughter did. She stopped weeping, and she thought. She thought about the dinner at Wexbury House, the same room, the same dowager, the same lord who owed her £300 and had called her a liar to keep from paying it. She thought about the magistrate's record sitting in Pellingham's office, the sworn statement, the verified note. She thought about the fact that the dowager had arranged a public dinner specifically to display her power over the situation, and she understood, with the cold, clear practicality that was her inheritance, that a public room is a weapon that can be turned. The dowager meant to use the dinner to bury her. Eleanor decided to attend it. She had no invitation. She did not need one. She needed only the £300 owed to her father's estate to come due in front of the people who had watched it be denied, and she needed the proof in her hand and her voice steady and her father's daughter standing where the liar had stood. She wrote to Pelling. She wrote to Marsh. She did not write to the Duke of Ashworth, because she would not be saved by him, and because some part of her could not bear to learn from his own pen that he was to marry Miss Vane. The dinner at Wexbury House was the grandest of the season's early entertainments, 30 at the long table and 40 more arriving after, for cards and music, and the dowager presided over it like a general who has already won and merely awaits the formal surrender. Miss Sophia Vane sat at the Duke of Ashworth's right hand in white silk, and looked at him with the open, hopeful face of a girl who has been told a thing is settled. The Duke was civil to her. He was civil to everyone. He had not been told that Eleanor knew of the dinner, and he had spent 4 days in a state his household had never witnessed, short with his staff and unable to sit, because he had understood the moment he saw the seating arrangement exactly what the dowager intended, and he had not yet found the way to undo it without confirming every cruel thing she would say of Eleanor. The moment he acted, the covers had been removed, and the second course laid, when the footman at the door, flustered, announced that a Miss Hartley had arrived and would not be turned away, and the long table went still in the particular way Eleanor had learned to recognize, the stillness of a room preparing to watch something taken from someone. She came in alone. She wore the gray gown. She had decided against borrowing finery she could not afford and could not carry with conviction, and she walked the length of the room in plain gray wool, past the silk and the diamonds with her father's papers in a flat leather folder held in both her gloved hands, and she did not look at the Duke of Ashworth, who had risen halfway from his chair before he caught himself. "You were not invited," said the dowager, and her voice was steady, but a person who knew her would have heard the first hairline crack in it, because Eleanor was not supposed to come. Ruined women did not walk back into the rooms that had ruined them, and the dowager's certainty had not accounted for a woman who would. "No, madam," Eleanor said. "I was not. I have come for the same reason I came the first time, and I have been told that the same gentlemen are present, which is convenient, because what I have to say concerns them." Lord Crandall further down the table made the mistake of laughing. "She is back with her satchel," he said to the man beside him, loud enough, always loud enough. "The attorney's daughter and her forgeries. Some people cannot be taught." It was the third time he had called her a liar, and it was the last. Eleanor set the leather folder on the white cloth among the silver, and opened it with hands that did not shake, because she had spent every fear she had on the walk down the length of the room, and arrived at the table with none left. She drew out the promissory note first. She drew out the steward's sworn statement. She drew out the magistrate's record, dated and sealed, and she laid the three documents side by side where the candlelight fell on them, and she spoke not to Lord Crandall but to the table, to all of them, in the clear, unhurried voice her father had used in country courtrooms. "This is a note for £300, signed by Lord Crandall in his own hand, witnessed by Mr. Marsh, who served the Crandall family 30 years. This is Mr. Marsh's statement, sworn before a magistrate not 3 weeks past, that he watched the signing. This is the magistrate's record of that swearing. The note is genuine. The debt is real. It has been real since the day his lordship signed it, and his lordship has known it was real every hour that he has stood in rooms like this one and called me a liar to avoid paying it. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room turning on a ruined woman. It was the other silence, the one where a room realizes it has been wrong, and that it has been made an accomplice in the wrongness, and that the comfortable thing it chose to believe was chosen for it by people it had trusted too long. Eyes went to Lord Crandall. Lord Crandall had stopped laughing. He looked at the documents on the cloth, and his face did the thing a face does when the floor it stood on is no longer there. The dowager rose. She was magnificent in her ruin. One had to grant her that, upright and composed with her diamonds catching the light, and she opened her mouth to do the only thing left to her, which was to deny the documents as she had denied the woman. To call the magistrate's seal a forgery, as her son had called the note a forgery. To spend the last of her enormous credit in this society on the assertion that paper lies and rank does not. She did not get the chance. The Duke of Ashworth rose from his place at Miss Vane's right hand. He did not hurry. He crossed the room in the slow, ceremonial way of a man who has decided something and means everyone present to witness the deciding. And he came to stand beside Eleanor Hartley at the head of the long table, in the candlelight. I in front of the dowager, and the lord and the diamond of the season, and 40 people who had watched her, called a liar twice in this house, and the whole room understood before he spoke that a duke standing at a woman's side is itself a sentence. He looked at the dowager. He looked at Lord Crandall. Then he turned to Eleanor, and his face in the candlelight was not cold at all, and he said the thing once, clearly, in a voice that carried to the farthest cards table. "This lady tells the truth, and I mean to marry her." The dowager sat down. She did not decide to. Her body did it for her, the architecture of 40 years giving way at the foundation, and her fan slipped from her fingers to the floor, and no one moved to retrieve it. Lord Crandall stared at the documents as though they might rearrange themselves into mercy. Miss Sophia Vane, at the Duke's empty place, turned to look at Eleanor with an expression that was not jealousy, but something closer to relief. The face of a girl who has just been released from a future chosen for her. And later, much later, the two women would become friends. But that is another evening's story. No one spoke. The Duke of Ashworth had said 11 words, and the 11 words had finished it. He picked up Eleanor's leather folder from the cloth and closed it gently and returned it to her hands, and the small courtesy of it, the careful return of her father's careful papers, was the thing that finally broke her composure where the cruelty never had. She stood at the head of the table with the proof of her honesty in her hands, and a duke at her side and a room full of people learning all at once that they had been wrong. And she did not weep, but it was a near thing, and he saw that it was, and he did not look away. Pellingham, the solicitor, who had been waiting in the hall on Eleanor's instruction, came forward then with the formal demand for payment of the debt properly drawn, and the matter passed in the space of a few quiet sentences from a scandal into a transaction which is what it had always honestly been. Lord Crandall would pay the £300. He would pay it because the alternative was a magistrate, and a magistrate was a thing even a lord's mother could not deny into nothing. The hierarchy had not been destroyed. It had merely, for once, been made to keep its own rules. Eleanor and the Duke of Ashworth were married in the spring, quietly. At the small church near the house her father had left her, with Marsh in the second pew and Pellingham in the third, and Miss Vane, by then a friend, holding the flowers. The county that had called her a liar called on her instead, as counties do, having always known. They now recalled that there was something fine in the Hartley girl. The Duke gave her as a wedding gift, a thing she had not asked for, and could not at first speak when she saw it. He had taken her father's promissory note, the genuine one, the £300 note that had begun the whole of it, and he had it framed in plain dark wood, and hung where she would see it each morning, not as a trophy of the debt collected, but as a record of the keeping that had saved her. Thomas Hartley's careful hand preserved behind glass, where no one could ever again call it false. On a winter evening near the end of that first year, in the warm, small sitting room she had made for herself in the great house, Eleanor sat by the fire, with her father's oldest letter open on her knee, the one she had pressed flat beneath her hand the night she learned of Miss Vane, the one that had survived every cold room and every long walk, and every accusation. The snow had begun to fall against the dark window. Her husband came in and stood behind her chair and put his hand on her shoulder, and she covered it with her own, and neither of them said anything for a while, because the framed note hung on the wall above the hearth and said it all already. The fire moved, the snow fell. Somewhere in the house a clock kept the careful time her father would have approved of, and the letter lay open on her knee, and she was for the first time since a March morning 6 months and a lifetime ago entirely seen and entirely safe. She had walked into that room a liar, by their telling. She walked out of it a duchess, by her own. Thank you for staying with Eleanor until the end. If her quiet courage moved you, I would be glad to know which moments stayed with you, and I hope you will keep her company again in the next story.